Amidst all of the fighting and explosions, I kept an eye for any useful loot, the canticle augury scans flashing rapidly on my holoscreen and comparing the Orc ships with the Imperium's known ships' profiles. While from the front or side the vessels would be mostly unrecognizable, due to erratic weapons and armor plates add-ons improvised by Orc meek boys, from behind the number and placement of engines was a dead giveaway. Cruisers of Mars and lunar patterns, light cruisers and frigates, transport barges and ore haulers, even an ironclad battleship and an exorcist grand cruiser. It seemed this Orc was composed of at least 80% from retrofitted Imperium vessels. Didn't fill me with confidence about the success rate of the Imperial Navy in their campaigns, nor the safety of the Imperium supply lines. The bridge tech priest soon achieved long-range contact with Ryza and began imputing the Forge Worlds designations for these Orcs of WoG, Grax and Raguts. The Grax WoG had been ongoing for a longer time, and the promise of fighting and loot had drawn in the newly arrived Raguts WoG, which we were busy crippling right now. Captain, I have located 2 main war bosses, on their largest ships. I recommend we target them with vortex warheads. The data cheer expert Margus announced a minute later. I mused at that proposal for a minute, then decided not to. Infesting those ships with demons wouldn't help me salvage them, plus Forge Ryza did not send me a plea to use any means to rescue them. Nor was I confident I could close those rifts with my small fleet. I checked the system map for something that could help and noticed a battle barge of the Space Wolves chapter, with an Astartes strike cruiser as escort. Now, these guys would be useful indeed. Margus, send a Vox communique to the Space Wolves and request a marine company to support us boarding and capturing the largest ships of Raguts WoG. I ordered, then I turned towards the Army Regiment colonels standing ready at the holomap table. Colonels, I can expend 2 corvettes as boarding crafts for our guardsmen and servitors. Don't let their sacrifice be in vain. Those big ships have to be captured and returned into humanity's hands, I proclaimed quite heroically. Without engines to provide constant acceleration, the ironclad and the exorcist were falling behind their other ships, still pressing the big red button to reach Forge Ryza faster. I urged the Canticle to target 2 Mars-type cruisers next, and to blow up as many smaller ships it could. The machine spirit seemed angry and excited, and obeyed eagerly, increasing the rate of fire of our lance batteries and adjusting course to gain better angles for the next torpedo salvo. No matter how bullshit the warp manipulation of an Orc war was, a ship without engines couldn't steer as well as one with functional engines. The Orcs tried, of course, assembling sails made of metal plates and oars made of long antennas or support beams, and it even worked to a very small degree. But paddling in the void with oars, as illogical and nonsensical it might be, was too slow, and we could steer ourselves away from their big guns firing arcs. They launched fighter bombers and other assault craft to annoy us, but my fleet did have amazingly good point defense weapons, and new ships. We barely missed any of their smoking and sputtering contraptions, some even powered by coal and steam engines by the looks of them. But if the Orcs overran Ryza, they would have the best of the Imperium's plasma reactors and weapons, and would become a major threat to the entire galaxy. Couldn't let that happen. Captain, the Space Wolves have agreed to dispatch 2 Terminator squads and some assault marines to spearhead the boarding parties. ETA 3 hours. The tech priest proclaimed victoriously. Indeed, even with such small numbers the Astartes knew their jobs well. They even had genetically modified dogs the size of a car to help, though I wasn't sure any dog could serve as a mount for a Terminator pattern power armor. We shall see. The wet dogs of Rus, Ludvius muttered with a weird voice. The other Astartes in my crew remained silent and calm, simply examining the space battle and taking mental notes. At least he was learning, my scythe captain. Anyway, those 3 hours should give us plenty time to secure and isolate our boarding targets, and even begin initial landings, so I could claim ownership over these relics after the Orcs were exterminated. Darting to the sides and below the huge Orc behemoths, my corvettes expended all their consumable ammunition to thin out the more fragile Orc escorts and transports. Soon enough, the torpedoes were reloaded again and the Mars-class cruisers under Orc control also lost their engines and speed, drifting behind the main front of the Orc war. I then focused the lance batteries of the Canticle on the remaining light cruisers and simply evaporated their exposed backsides, and filled the void with 24 hulks spinning out of control. We also had to slow down to maintain our safe-ish position to the rear of the bigger Orc battleship, and soon the Orc war left the range of our weapons. Torpedoes did have a longer range, and our last salvo caught 2 Orc-infested lunar cruisers from behind and left them crippled far ahead of my fleet. Meanwhile, our lance batteries began cutting large holes into our targets, exposing the Orcs to vacuum and clearing a path into the interior. Servitors and tech priests, as well as the smaller armor like weasels and sentinels, began loading into the 2 sacrificial corvettes, which will act as a kilometer-long boarding torpedo. The more squishy guardsmen and grenadiers, with a battalion of Void Marines, would arrive later and insert via shuttle and then through the length on the corvette into the battleship and the Grand Cruiser. 2 hours later the first corvette accelerated and hit the ironclad into the weaker backside, sticking out like a funnel. Good enough. Begin the liberation, colonels, I ordered while changing the focus of my attention on the next prize. The second corvette was ready and impacted the Exorcist just before the Astartes strike cruiser arrived. I just pointed to the next batch of army colonels, gifted to me by various Forge Worlds along with their guard regiments. I didn't quite see eye to eye with most of them, but they were useful nonetheless. Mostly for defending entrenched positions, sadly. They worked great at Istobon, during the defensive phase, and struggled to keep up and adapt to maneuver and other attacking tactics in the liberation phase. It didn't matter that much because Istobon and the Iron Hands had more than enough heavy machines and expertise for assaults, but I still wasn't happy with their poor training. Rogue Trader Lancefire, your arrival was fortuitous. I see you have already begun boarding the largest Orc vessels. Very commendable. A voice with a strange accent arrived on the Vox channel. Your target is the Orc war bosses, Astartes. Try not to damage my salvage prizes overly much. Pef out. I replied with a wry voice. An amused chuckle was the only response from that space wolf. Overwhelming firepower was in their codex. I should be happy if anything was left standing, after they completed the mission. Escorts, spread out in pattern Omicron. Auguries scans to maximum and keep an eye for any sneaky Xenos prowling about. I ordered on the clan channel, dispersing the corvettes farther out in a sphere, to increase visibility and cross-sectional scan profiles. Soon enough, the helpful Astartes took the lead and began butchering their way deeper into the derelict spaceships, filling the hallways with splattered green mushrooms and bolter casings. How about you two, wanna go loosen up those violent inner urges? I wondered idly, turning to my guardian Astartes. Ludvius growled at me, while Captain Thracius just nodded calmly. It is our duty, Lord Pef, to try and avoid getting into more fist fights, if you can. He advised me politely, and checked his combi bolter the 10th time. I just waved him off. Your own chaplain punched me, you wise ass. You too, Ludvius? I wondered out loud. Stay safe, Captain, he replied with a serene voice. After the Space Marines left, I turned towards the Riser Tech Priest. Margus, assemble the rest of the available servitors and tech priests and secure the crippled cruisers. Once the reactors are safe and powered down, we may begin cleansing the greenskins as well. Captain, that would leave our ship without vital security and tech support. He argued just like I taught him. It made sense to have your subordinates point out critical mistakes, after all. All true, Tech Priest. But we are here at Riser. I'm sure your Fabricator General will replenish my losses, once I gift him a captured ship or two. I replied, a bit amused, pointing at the system map. The Tech Priest blinked and then nodded a second later. You are correct, Captain. A cruiser is worth 100 times as much as any losses we might sustain from boarding operations. I know, my friend. I invented the gift game. Each capital ship salvaged would be a favor with Riser, and if they wanted the relic Grand Cruiser I would get something even nicer in return. And losses we did sustain, tens of thousands of servitors and some guardsmen, even with light armor support and Void Marines lobbing crack grenades into every corridor. The Orcs fought back with passion and disregard for losses, and our salvage expeditions to the lunar cruisers farther away had to retreat ignominiously, although they did achieve the primary objectives and shut down the reactors. I redirected the remaining troops and servitors on the Mars cruisers and sent out more light tanks and sentinels to compensate for the obvious lack of power armor. Imperium ships were built with huge inner hangars and wide hallways, so this strategy worked somewhat. Flamers and grenades were much more useful in tight spaces, frying thousands of Greekins and Orc boys, and somewhat countering the more armored Nobs and Meek boys. The Ard boys were a more difficult target, protected by heavy metal plates and impossible biological resilience, than the normal shooter boys or slugger boys, but fire is a great equalizer. By the end of the day, the Space Wolves had terminated one war boss on the Ironclad and diverted some Grey Hunters to help clear out the Mars cruisers, while the Terminators transferred on the Exorcist Grand Cruiser, after they reloaded all the spent bolter ammunition. Immediately, the tides changed, as the Astartes simply plowed through the fierce Orc resistance and cleared the main hallways towards the bridge and the reactor bulkheads. Sometime during this engagement, the real war boss died under Astartes Terminator's assault, and the Raguts were simply shattered into 100 small splinters all around the star system. Their warp distortions also failed, and many illogical Orc weapons or armors became ineffective or just stopped working. Thus, we renewed our offensive boarding with 10 times fewer casualties, and rapidly overrun the Mars cruisers. The assault landers returned to the lunar cruisers and managed to capture them as well. After that, it became even easier, and one by one the light cruisers were boarded and disinfected from the fungal infestation, leaving the tech priests to begin reconsecrating the derelicts and cleanse the corpses. Of course, that meant my medical bay was again filled with wounded and cripples, giving something to do for the biologist magi and my dear doctors/concubines. Thousands of irradiated and sick serfs from the lower decks were called to be converted into more servitors as a stopgap, and during this culling the tech priests detected 9 more blanks among the indentured crew. I set them aside as a gift for Isa, should it be interested in replicating blank machine spirits. I was quite certain they would. Made me wonder if constant exposure for generations to the warp had created even more blanks among the serfs of the Navy, which seemed probable. It could be simply my extraordinary luck, or it could be a general trend among humanity. Clearing the big ships took more time, as expected. My troops soon ran out of bolter ammunition and had to fall back on lasguns and flamers, while the Astartes had their potent melee weapons and servo-powered strength to keep slashing and chopping. I provided 100 STCs produced at Antax to serve as temporary barracks for my organic troops, as well as for sleep and recovery on board the enormous Orc warships. The tech priests were poking them in confusion, as intended. Containers with the STC designations didn't quite compute in their Mechonicus cult dogma. Of course, the Grenadiers and Void Marines were too tired to care, simply glad at having a safe-ish place to eat and sleep. Nearly a month later, both ships were declared reasonably secure and the Astartes departed for their continued crusade against the other Orkwog. I decided to wait and let my troops rest and recover while the tech priests inventoried and collected anything of value from my prizes. Sadly, most of the comical-looking weaponry that we captured didn't work anymore, possibly because the silly Meek boys used welding or hammers to fix their devices, powering them with belief and stupidity. Once the warfield dissolved, the weapons became rusted scraps and unstable power cells ready to blow at nearest touch. However, the Dead Pain Boys, known also as Mad Docs, did have real artifacts stapled onto them, some of them relics of Astartes Genetas or librarians, including trauma packs and valuable life_extension_technologies. One of them was a huge claw with the ability to connect a human mind, or even an orc, to a mind impulse unit and allow that person to control machinery with their minds, just as a princeps mentally controls an Imperial Titan. Or so my Antax provided advisor whispered while measuring me for some future upgrade. Other serums and injections would be valuable as well, after the biologist magi checked them 10 times for safety and doctrinal integrity. The other find was a wired boy bound tightly by the Orcs themselves into a prison cell, eyes exploded but still alive. His neck and chest were covered with phase iron manacles and chains, possibly to keep the warp user from exploding the ship or the Orc tribe itself. He wouldn't be that dangerous right now, and nearly irrelevant to myself. I also decided to keep him as a gift for Isa, complete with the ton of ultra-rare phase iron bindings, worth a battle cruiser by itself. Then I thought again and decided to chop off the wired boy's arms and salvage some phase iron for my own use. Something like a crossbow bolt tipped with phase iron couldn't be parried by the next chaos sorcerer trying to ruin my wrist. The adamantium hull of the ironclad battleship was of enormous value again, and I just realized how lucky our warp emergence had been. I doubted a vortex missile would have damaged the ironclad sufficiently, and it would have been impervious to anything else I had. I managed to steal away a hangar full of adamantium plates from broken bulkheads and doors, since the Astartes haven't been careful or frugal with their firepower. Luckily, I did have armed sentinels and logistic weasels to help me transport and handle the heavy adamantium plates. A day later, an Ark Mechanicus cruiser arrived from Forge Riser, with the fabricator Locum on board. It was time for gifts and making friends. At his place, not mine. Captain Lancefire. We meet at last. Who knew you would employ the Overlord in aid of our Forge world, and so soon? The fabricator began with a rhetorical question. Ludvius gestured with 3 fingers at me. Something in Astartes battle speak about being cautious and thinking thrice before speaking. Obviously, Forge Riser did. A sign from Omnissiah, as a gift would be returned thrice if given with a pure heart. I answered gently and followed him inside his armored quarters. Ludvius snorted and leaned on the metal wall of the hallway, to await my eventual return or survival. The fabricator stared at me for a minute, waiting for the punchline. I admit I don't understand. He replied with a wave of tentacle. There's a grand cruiser, a battleship, a few Mars, lunar and dozens of light cruisers in my gift, fabricator. I'm sure even the outer shell is worth something, if sold for scrap. I argued humbly and sat in the indicated chair. The Magus sighed audibly, emitting a wheezing noise like something mechanical wobbled in his chest. You're being ridiculous, Lord Pef. That adamantium ironclad is worth some 3 trillion thrones, even if sold for scrap. And a nearly intact Grand Cruiser is worth at least another Overlord-class cruiser, just like the Canticle. He answered with a flutter of mechadendrites. Perhaps upset or irritated, maybe both. Cyborg body language is hard to read, because they never seem to have the same numbers of limbs and joints. I just shrugged. If you say so. Here, more gifts of another nature, I said flatly and began handing over the plasma-based templates and my failed volcano patterns. Surely Riser will manage to make them work. I never seen a tech priest cry till now, but perhaps insurmountable joy was not something their logi engines were prepared to counter. So, I patted his orange robe over the shoulder. There. No need to cry, Margus. I know the STC templates are a bit damaged, but you have a million genial magi on Riser. Perhaps they can be repaired in a few decades. I advised him in a sad voice. The Archmagos sobbed harder, so perhaps I fucked up worse than I thought. A minute later the fabricator composed himself and patted my head in a gentle move. We will remember this gift, Lord Pef. There is little Forge Riser cannot do, as we have entire sectors beholden to us, shipyards, regiments and technologies as advanced as Mars itself. He promised in a more sober tone. I just nodded, since it made sense. Your world is in trouble right now, Margus. I'll try to help, but my troops and servitors are nearly depleted. The same with our torpedoes and missiles, and most consumables. 100,000 injured and crippled guardsmen. And then, I had to sacrifice 2 perfectly good corvettes to deploy sufficient forces for a beachhead. The Margus blinked in confusion, then acceptance. Anything you need, Captain Pef. 2 corvettes are precious for me. Perhaps your forge can repair them at half cost? I asked humbly. The fabricator sighed and turned away. Yes. We will repair the ships. He allowed in a softer voice. I pumped my fist in obvious joy. Many thanks, Margus. I'll let you return to your duties, while my surviving tech priests complete whatever repairs they can. I announced in a pleasant voice and left his rooms, and followed Ludvius back to my ship. Obviously, this won't end here, but Riser would need to check everything, before agreeing to trade some rewards to the peculiar rogue trader. What I wanted was not to empty their stasis cells of valuable machines and weapons already promised to the Navy or the Army. I wanted production templates and forges. I wanted their plasma technology spread towards 1,000 forge worlds, large or small. In my view, The Mechonicus had too little power in the Imperium, for a group that should have held half of everything. Among the Lords of Terror, there were not 6 tech priest magi, but only 1. The 11 other lords were too strong with their majority votes, and could dictate policy and even exterminate entire Forge worlds at their whim. Even the rogue traders were beholden to the Administratum, their warrants subject to censure or removal, something that didn't stand well for my own safety and freedom. In theory, I could send requisition forms to Terra and demand to be granted more ships and regiments for my exploration efforts, or to repair losses in defense of the Imperium. In practice, some scribe in the Administratum would flag my request to the Inquisition or the Vindicare assassins, because it would be cheaper to solve my legal but expensive procedure due to my expiration date. This was also the main reason I avoided big merchant or hive worlds, where the Administratum would begin auditing my conquests and plunder for a substantial tithe, or perhaps simply confiscate my empire with a stroke of their brass typewriters. By giving away the stuff I earned to various Forge worlds, I sold nothing and received no revenue. Hopefully, other rogue traders would begin catching on, and start doing something similar. They just needed me to create a workable and rich path, something too attractive even to some rapacious trader like my father had been. I even had the perfect and unassailable motive, as donations to the cult of Omnissiah. If the Administratum wanted to impose taxation on religious donations, the ecclesiarchy would promptly object and veto that, as they too received humongous donations from nearly everyone in the Imperium. Very little from my own dynasty, as it happens. And here, Forge Riser was the key, with their strong ties to Mars itself, having been founded by the Red Planet way back. A week later, my fleet started moving again, shifting course to approach the larger ships of Wagrax from below and behind. This potent armada had 3 grand cruisers and 2 battleships among their heavy ships, with over a 24 kill cruisers and a small space hulk composed of some 50 different ships of various races and ages. My fleet accelerated to flank speed and unleashed everything we had left on the optimal placetalk_ battleship, shutting off and melting the engines before the rest of the Orc armada could turn and chase us. Sadly, another corvette got lost to this daring raid, because a crazy Orc simply flared their cruiser's engines to the maximum, and aided by the war magic reached a faster speed than a ship 1,000 times lighter. However, that also exposed their weaker sides and rear to the defense fleet of Forge Riser, who didn't lack torpedoes and other weapons to punish the Orc's stupidity. For this single stunt and my precious corvette, the Graxwog lost 30 ships and even a battleship, which continued its spiraling orbit and crash-landed on a nearby moon. Still, the damn thing seemed intact and kept shooting the remaining guns and big guns at anyone approaching that moon. I estimate with 80% probability for the Grax war boss to have been on the crashed battleship. Still alive it seems. The bridge tech priest explained after trying to figure out how that ship didn't simply make a deep crater or explode, or both. Lucky targeting perhaps. Let Forge Riser and the Astartes know about the Orc boss. And tell them we're out of torpedoes, except that fancy one that the Inquisitor asked me not to use. Bicycle torpedo or something, I demanded with an innocent voice. Ludvius snorted in amusement, as the Magus began spluttering Benharic cants and litanies about the sacred flame of the Omnissiah. Cyclonic torpedoes were not bicycles, but I was not a tech priest, so I got the benefit of doubt. It didn't take an entire minute for a couple of Mechonicus cruisers to break off from the battle lines and speed away, then change course to intercept us at a fairly good distance from the fight. Soon enough, the servants of Omnissiah began transferring 100 torpedoes and replenishment servitors, without any more hints of half-cost. Did I tell you how stupid Orcs are? We repeated the same trick a dozen times over the next month, slowly but surely eliminating the larger Orc warships and causing them to drift away without a real chance at steering or slowing down. The Astartes failed to kill the war boss stranded on the moon with their small strike teams, but I focused my attention on capturing the other battleship, this time without sacrificing another corvette. Using our lances to open up landing spots for assault boats, and nearly all the replenished servitors, we began boarding the derelict battleship, while still enduring near-suicidal waves of Orc bombers and escorts trying to save their big ship. We could only shut down the reactor and silence their weapons, then we held defensive positions inside the deformed bulkheads with more weasels and sentinels, waiting for reinforcements. In the end, The Space Wolves began helping with more Grey Wolves as tactical marines and some tiny tractors with huge guns on them, called Rapier. They did a good job despite the silly looks, but then a big gun on a long hallway would be quite lethal. Ludvius went inside to take a look and meet his brothers for some banter, but I was told it was a real war zone, so I should stay put. So I did. He brought back a shuttle filled with exotic archaeotech and even Xeno weapons, which we hid away in a hangar for my later perusal and deep scans. He was also badly injured and leaking stuff from his ears, because the idiot thought helms were for bitches. While Ludvius recovered, Captain Thracius took the job of bedroom guard, and he didn't seem to like it, hiding his pure eyes from my carnal pleasure. "You want my descendants to consider joining your chapter, Astartes?" I asked after the last concubine departed with a dreamy smile. The scythe blinked in confusion. Why wouldn't they consider it? It is the greatest honor to serve the Emperor, even in death. All right then. It's not like the Blood Angels don't need more blank recruits, immune to warp or mutations. I suppose your chapter is free of any such problems like demonic taint or corruption. I answered with a shrug, and sat down in my cogitator chair. And did nothing, because I couldn't know how this space marine might react. I missed my Rose and her sealed by Inquisition perk. Hopefully she'll find another batch of Death Watch Astartes and other sneaky acolytes for her retinue. And if she could find a rogue navigator to train our daughter, it would be even better. Navigators had dozens of special skills and abilities, but not the weak guys in the employ of the Mechonicus. Every Forge world had contracts with various navigator houses that would provide their heirs and lower talents for a cost, and poor Pef didn't qualify for a beta-level navigator. Even gamma-level like Lord Duros on the Litany were hard to find, and the deal made by my grandfather wasn't worth all that much. Possibly a rare trade route or a secret planet somewhere. Lord Duros wouldn't say, or possibly couldn't. Still, one day I would have my own navigator house, as well as a night house. Perhaps my own Astartes chapter, if I didn't get killed too soon. Constructing a real Forge world at Retribution would take at least decades, or perhaps a century, and that if we managed to avoid getting invaded by something big. Anyways, we conducted a last raid and demolished a dozen more cruisers, expending most torpedoes and tricking more Orcs ships to follow us on a chase, when the fleet at Riser changed stance and began attacking. Gravity beams, neutron guns, plasma guns of a dozen types, las cannons and macro batteries filled the void, and breaking the back of the Orc war. I launched another boarding party on a Grand Cruiser, just to be able to claim it for my clan. Soon enough, Skitarian servitors and various battle automata from Riser joined my troops and unleashed promethium, phosphorus and plasma on the silly Orc crew, crushing everyone in their unstoppable march. The machines fought back, and they won the day. While the surface of the Riser was still crawling with billions of Orcs, with the orbital siege lifted, the hardest part was over. Billions of servitors and their commanding tech priests arrived to engulf the derelict Orc ships in reclamation workforce. Under my eyes, smaller escorts and even the light cruiser hulls were being swiftly dismantled and brought to the orbital shipyards for reforging into new Mechonicus or Navy vessels. As Riser had the best plasma technology and expertise around, they kept the larger hulls intact and just pushed them farther out, to have their plasma engines rebuilt and the hulls cleaned and sanctified. It would still take decades to rebuild a Grand Cruiser and even longer for a battleship. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Mechonicus Navy fired salvo after salvo at the crashed Orc battleship on the Moon, without visible effect. The Damwar field was still going strong, anchored into the body or soul of that Grax war boss. Still, it seemed to me that Riser wasn't really trying to end the invasion, and instead used it as opportunity to test their machines in relative safety, close to supply lines and without having to transport the huge titans and robots to another system. Good target practice, right Margus? I asked idly, while examining the battle lines from orbit. Perhaps so, Captain. Forge World Riser should possess more than enough firepower to wipe out these Orcs. Majoris replied after a few seconds of contemplation. Not his full name, but there was a Majoris title in there, so I went with it. I engaged the Savant implant to consider why this was happening. If a Forge world was under invasion, their quota and tithes would be obviously much reduced, or perhaps even suspended. Sneaky way to conduct tax evasion, while also field testing various war machines on a nearby battlefield. Try to see if the fabricator general can receive me, in private. I added in a fake whisper and left the bridge to Wenchen. My elder uncle had good instincts and plenty command experience. Then I went to my rooms, and began importing schematics and templates on another database, things that were not finished but would be useful to the millions worlds in the Empire. From weapons and vehicles, to industrial designs and agricultural machines, logistical upgrades and facilities, including the standardized containers, wheeled and rail transport beds for them, also water-based transports like container ships, cargo carriers for the merchant navy and chartist captains. Then I had health and ecologic designs, chemical filters and ultraviolet light barriers, electric trains and tramways for faster and cleaner transport, water purification and desalination, and more. For defense, I compiled a set of forts and orbital fortresses without major or glaring weaknesses. Metallic asteroids, powered by a plasma reactor and enveloped by a shield. Variants of them were armed with lances, torpedoes, attack craft, point defense and even nova cannons. Then a simple corvette pattern without warp engines but stronger shields and point defense and extra torpedo launchers, in vertical cells. Practically a system missile boat, that could emerge if the system was under attack, or be carried as a parasite craft inside a universe-class conveyor. 1,000 of such system corvettes, if the carrier was well designed, with launch decks and wide hangars. I sketched a possible variant, envisioning a central rail line to bring torpedoes out from the armory and load them in blocks on the corvette, 30 per ship. With its 10 kilometers long and 3 kilometers tall cargo hold, a mass conveyor could have 10 decks with 100 corvettes ready to be launched like torpedoes, and still have plenty room to spare. Another similar design was a missile destroyer, but with normal warp engines and slightly bulkier as a result of the torpedoes stacked in a vertical cell block. STC template name, Los Angeles. Then a light cruiser with 100 dorsal torpedo tubes and 3 lance batteries on the ventral side, called the Macross Pattern Cruiser. I had begun loving the torpedoes, especially the servitor-piloted type that I used. Enormous range and devastating firepower, with little chance of being hit yourself. While my other sets of memories didn't include the exact operating principles and standards for these machines, they didn't need to. A Forge world would have 1 billion engineers ready to be assigned those designs and told to make them work. Funny enough, these were in fact ancient Terran designs, like the missile cruiser of the Navy or the missile submarine, even the cargo vessels and electric trains. Then again, Terra was now an arid planet without a drop of water, and the Himalayas mountains have been sculpted into the Imperial Palace. Many parts of the Holy Planet were still greatly irradiated or polluted so much that the pollution itself seeped into the ground to form new oil fields. Scars of tens of thousands of years of constant warfare were visible in every pict, craters and canyons formed by titanic weapons in place of the old cities. The future had not been kind, and it would only get worse. My musings were interrupted by Helena, who entered my room looking tired and drained. Most likely another hospital shift. She sat in my lap and stared at the Holy Terror picked on a holoscreen. "Will we ever see it for real?" she asked in a longing voice. Her emperor, and grudgingly mine as well, rested on the golden throne, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. My own hand was proof of his real powers, even mostly dead as he was. Soon enough, my dear. A few more Primarchs need to die, and others found again. Give me 1,000 years to get my affairs in order. I answered softly and massaged her toned body with deft hands. Tharsius coughed in warning. Right, big capital I sealed secret for now. She fell asleep, and I carried her to my bed, and went on another tour of the ship, inspecting for damage, checking with the Master of Arms and all the various service heads. A single campaign, fairly short at that, and the Canticle needed at least 6 months in dockyard, plus near total replenishment of servitors and lower deck serfs. Perhaps Riser will be nice enough to install triple void shields on my battle cruiser, and provide other upgrades to armor and torpedo tubes. Then I visited the fighter deck, which was kinda small for a ship of this size. The Litany could carry 3 squadrons of fighters, and the Canticle had only 4 squadrons, being designed for long and medium-range battles via torpedoes and lances. Of the total 100 pilots, 22 were my daughters and 37 other clan members. It seems being a space fighter pilot is still an honor and probably an adrenaline rush as well. This wasn't my mansion on Aliva, so the girls wouldn't try their wiles on me, and Daddy, kiss my elbow, it hurts tricks. While my kids were healthy and looked well, their machines were not. Riddled with bullets, holes and missile shrapnel, I would be safer to just kick them overboard. Perhaps Riser could replace them. Need anything from me, pilots? I asked to make sure. They hesitated and glanced to the damaged fighters. Better armor on the birds, and more missiles, their flight leader demanded as everyone laughed. I'll see what I can do. Prepare an escort for my shuttle, the most damaged Furies that can still fly, I commanded with the right tone, and walked towards the next hangar, with the shuttles and assault boats. These were riddled with holes and burn marks as well, due to hostile boardings under fire. I almost decided to pick a wobbly shuttle, then I thought again. My own person would be at unnecessary risk. A Stormbird had the Geller field as well, and chaos wouldn't just wait to be purged. Heading towards Riser? Tharsius asked with a wary tone. Of course. We'll have air cover and orbital support, my friend. I answered a bit more confidently. Fine, helmet stays on. My bodyguard demanded as the ramp began to close. I nodded in agreement. Wouldn't want my lungs to freeze if the lander depressurized for some reason. As the Stormbird lifted off, I obediently mounted my armored helmet and checked my weapons, just like the Astartes did. Hell pistol, power dagger and 3 flash grenades, just in case. My void guards became alert and silent now, and 2 armed sentinels locked their feet with magnetic clamps to cover the ramp. A minute later the fighters formed a protective wing on us, and we began descending towards the main spire of the Forge Riser. Passing through Risen Air Defense Corridor, IFF check. The lander's pilot announced on the Intervox speakers. Clear to land now, beginning retro burn, he continued in a professional tone. The Stormbird shook and trembled then settled down. Be advised, I see Astartes and dogs among the welcoming party. I sighed and pointed at the ramp, letting my escort go first and secure the landing pad. Probably made quite a sight, 2 large walkers with chainswords and autoguns providing deterrence and a show of strength. My Void Marines were not as imposing, even with their burned and scratched carapace armor, but then Tharsius emerged and observed the landing pad for a minute, before urging me to come. Landing secure, Lord Pef. Still, head directly inside and don't pet the dogs. They might bite, he announced in a loud voice. A dozen wolves growled menacingly, showing long canines and shaking their furs. I advanced and slapped the biggest space wolf on his furred shoulder. Well met, Astartes. Don't bite my hand, okay? He slapped me back and nearly broke my spine. Ha ha ha, you really are a funny guy. Is it true an angel grew back your hand? He wondered out loud. I wasn't conscious at that time, and my implants didn't record anything. But before that, I recall slashing a Chaos Sorcerer and trying to stab the Word-Bearer in the face. He was too fast though, I admitted in a pleasant tone. The big Astartes chuckled and glanced at Tharsius in disbelief. I was on Istobon, busy killing Fulgrim at that time. But witnesses say he kicked the traitor in the balls after his arm was caught. The Scythe explained with an amused voice. The other space wolves howled in mirth and glee and pounded my shoulders for my bravery. Good enough for a puppy, Lord Lancefire. Any smart idea how to get to that war boss? Another space wolf asked in a more sober voice. I nodded and walked away. Of course. But I want a puppy for that, I quipped, pointing at the ferocious guardian wolf to my side. The wolf snarled at my hand and drew back. Damn blank aura. Inside the barricaded entrance, I was met by a company of Katakan_jungle_ fighters, as their planet was nearby and was able to send a dozen regiments to defend Riser. A big ogre bodyguard in makeshift armor stood in front of me, and eyed Tharsius with suspicion. Oi, you're kinda small for a space marine. Nork_Deed commented, possibly referring to my light power armor. I nodded and smiled. You're very smart, buddy. I'm a puppy marine, but I have this big spaceship, so it evens out. I also have this real Astartes as my bodyguard, just like you. Nork sees. A ship captain then. My boss is a colonel, so I win. The Ogrin proclaimed proudly towards the Scythe, pointing carelessly with his enormous hand at his commander, someone named Colonel Grice. Tharsis snorted and banged his chest plate in salute. We could use a regiment like them, Captain. Katakans are fierce warriors, he suggested without any ulterior motive. I took a mental note and stayed silent. Something to ask the fabricator then. It wasn't like regiments could simply be poached, although I technically could. The Katakan colonel glanced between me and my bodyguard with surprise. I mean, it was quite rare to see an Astartes in the retinue of a mere captain. Plus Tharsius was a captain himself, visible from the markings on his shoulder and knee pads. You are in command of that Overlord battlecruiser, Captain? He asked to make sure. Indeed. Inherited from my father. But since we lost most of our troops capturing the Torque battleship and 2 Grand Cruisers, we might need some fresh troops on board. You know, travel the galaxy, meet new and exotic people, and then kill them brutally. I mused out loud, and waved him goodbye. The man stared after me in confusion and perhaps amusement. Always made sense to use the helmet's visor to see behind you, via the implant link. A delegation of high-ranking magi received us in a sumptuous antechamber, decorated with metal cogs and tons of obscure heraldry or old relics. Welcome to Ryza, officially, Captain Lancefire and Captain Tharsius. I heard about Sutha. The Fabricator General told my bodyguard with a nod. Lord Pef evacuated everyone before he incinerated the planet, with 1 billion Tyranid Xenos killed while devouring all biomass. A worthy sacrifice, to stop that huge hive fleet. The Astartes allowed in a mourning tone. Well, it wouldn't have been pleasant to see your home go out in flames. I suppose we could repeat that trick, though perhaps using some orc planet and spare the Imperium from another loss. 2 Xenos with 1 shot. I mused to myself, and saw the Mechanicus perk up with attention. Wouldn't need to tell them twice, as they had better implants and logi engines than I had. A large adamantium door opened in front of me, leading to a proper strategy room, with a dozen holomaps and 100 magi of every clade busy coordinating the defense of their forge world. Every Magus in the retinue entered that room, except the forge leader who pointed at a smaller door to the side. All right then, Captain. You earned a private meeting. He invited me while pointing at a plasteel desk towards Thrisius. The room was lined with copper and brass inserts, and a myriad of bafflers and shield emitters sprang up as the door closed behind me. Tea, wine or something else? The fabricator offered politely. Something else, of course, I said and sat down on a metal throne, since my power armor would damage a leather couch. Your forge world is amazing, but you have forgotten your purpose. I spoke in a sterner voice, and poked my chest plate with the golden Aquila symbol. You mean the Imperium? A rogue trader that only deals with forge worlds? He wondered in surprise. This eagle head, right here, it's you, Fabricator. The cult Mechanicus. The other eagle is the Emperor's domain. There are 1,000 times more human worlds than forged worlds, and a single lord on Terra. Does that seem like parity of power to you? I asked rhetorically. He nodded slowly as he analyzed what I meant. So that's why the gifts. I begin to see why my fellow tech priests here in the Ultima Segmentum hold you so dear. I smiled gently and leaned back. I have a device, of sealed origins, that is used right now to redirect Hive Fleet Kraken on Mandragora. Really similar in ability with the Astronomicon. The Tyranids follow the psychic beacon in hope of more biomass, though the Necrons lack such weakness. The orange-robed archmagos froze for a second, then began making tea with a few tentacles, possibly as a calming ritual. Terra itself will draw more hive fleets then. Perhaps even the Eye of Terror, if what our navigators tell us is reliable. He mused in a wary voice. Excellent logical deductions, I had to admit. I did mention the Astronomicon, just for that. I have another gift, of a relating nature. Istobon makes blank machine spirits now, and there's 9 such blank persons kept safe on the Canticle, if you can spare some effort to replicate the process. Plus myself and my blank concubines, for calibration tests. Could be useful to have robots and titans immune to the warp and psychers. I mused after sipping the nice tea. The Fabricator General of Ryza just sighed and powered up a holoscreen with his own gifts. Let's not upset the trade balance that much, for now. We're deeply in your debt, Lord Pef. Pick whatever you find useful, and request what else it is not here. There were thousands of machines and weapons, space fighters and bombers, spaceships and auxiliary regiments, even navigators and astropaths. I didn't see anything really useful though, not in the long term. Sure, new fighters and a few escorts would be nice, but they weren't my own templates. Gunships and tanks, sentinels and troop carriers, artillery and anti-air vehicles. I did select a Kotakan regiment, one that had more women. Hopefully I could seduce a few hundreds of those fierce warrior women, for a stronger gene pool. Then I shrugged and closed the screen. What I would need is not here, Fabricator. Replacements are great of course, so you have my thanks. This isn't worth much, Lord Pef. Please, surely there is something Riser can do, even though we're in a small trouble for the moment. He argued and waved a few arms. Getting irate with my frugal ways, as expected. I tapped my backpack and removed some 30 data slates, and placed them on his work desk. What humanity needs, Fabricator, is civilization. Clear air, clean streets, cheap transport, open markets. We also need solid defenses for our worlds, not running from crisis to crisis. That means 1,000 ships over every hive world. It means 1,000,000 warships at every forged world. We should crush those bugs with impunity. They have claws and we have guns. Space guns, I exclaimed in disgust and sat back down with a thump. One could almost see the cogs spinning inside the cyborg's head. A few data cantrips escaped from a prayer box, before the tech priest stopped it. And how would this be achieved, Lord Pef? The Imperium strangles the cult with absurd rules and inquisitorial controls. Nearly every year, another Holy Forge gets bombarded by our so-called allies. He muttered, seeming desperate. That was it. Riser refused to work for the Imperium anymore. Sort of work strike, imposed by an orc invasion. I have nearly 100 worlds in the fringe, my friend. And there, I speak with the voice of the Emperor. My rules, for those who want to live there, I said, opening up the sector map. Here, in this small corner of the galaxy, there are 50 million stars and planets. Enough metal to build 1 billion ships. And once my blank genes spread among the people, the usual enemies will become much easier to defeat. Just another type of Xenos, that we can shoot with our blank machine spirits guiding our fire. I explained with fact-checked logic. Sure, the genial idea came from Antax, but their small forge world couldn't sustain such an enterprise. Even pimping out a cruiser took all their effort. Meanwhile, the Fabricator was examining the other designs I have envisioned, or remembered. For starters, an exploratory expedition, in force. We'd need to map out your future realm, and plan our strategy. And all this will take centuries, maybe millennia, he concluded after storing the data slates into a coded vault. I went and hugged my new best friend while he was quite confused. We'll need to coordinate with my other partners. For now, corvettes by the thousands to cover as much volume at once. And more Kotakans would be nice. The fringe is quite hostile to humans. I quipped as I waved goodbye and left his room. You didn't punch the Fabricator, did you? Tharsius asked while checking me for damage. What the hell did he think I was? An Ogrin? Wait, Ogrins, in power armor. We'll need 7 implants for all of them, but it could work. Or maybe some eugenics, select the smarter descendants? I wondered if I could procreate with an Ogrin female. Oh well. Time to find out.